Imagine a winter night at the very edge of the world. The sea is black, the sky even darker, and only a tiny, flickering light glows high above the crashing waves, stubborn and persistent, as if whispering, "I'm here. I'm alive. Don't be afraid." Inside that small beacon of light, behind thick stone walls, a person sits. They are not sleeping. Or rather, they are trying not to sleep, though their eyes are heavy and their body longs for at least 15 minutes of rest. But they can't, because the light must burn constantly, otherwise someone in the darkness might lose their way home. Lighthouse keepers are a special kind of people. They can't simply be called employees or workers. More accurately, they are monks of light, only without prayers or bells. Instead, they tend kerosene lamps, which must be refilled every few hours. The lenses require constant cleaning, and there is always the anticipation of when the storm will subside enough to allow a brief rest. Winter makes everything even more difficult. Cold seeps through the stone walls like an invisible guest, unwelcome but always present, lingering long after arrival. The keeper's work seems simple at first glance, but it demands unwavering discipline. The main task is to ensure the light burns uninterrupted through the entire night. This involves refilling the kerosene tank on time, adjusting the wick, wiping soot and condensation from the lenses, and turning the rotating mechanism that makes the light flicker at a specific interval. During the day, they perform maintenance, repairs, cleaning, recording in the logbook, all while surrounded by the constant roar of waves and the howling wind, in complete solitude. Months without a break. It might seem straightforward, but try not to go mad doing the same thing every day in a stone tower in the middle of the sea. Interestingly, most lighthouses weren't built for beauty, but for survival. Thick walls kept the waves from washing the tower away. Narrow windows prevented the wind from stealing all the heat in a single night, and spiral stairs fit into the tight space where straight ones simply couldn't. When the keeper ascended to the lantern room, it was as if they were entering a giant stone candle. The steps were icy, the handrail frozen, and at the top, their workspace, a glass enclosure with the light at the center, awaited. The lantern room smelled of kerosene, metal, and salt. That scent embedded itself into clothes, hair, skin, so much so that even after a week at the shore, people still noticed it. "Why do you smell like that?" acquaintances would grimace when meeting the keeper in the shop or outside. "Probably kerosene," the keeper would reply, sniffing at their sleeve. "I wash everything and air it out, but the smell just won't come out." And indeed, the kerosene aroma sank so deeply that no amount of washing could fully remove it. This scent became part of life, almost like a second nature, familiar as the smell of home. Only this home was vertical and always slightly swaying, even when standing on solid ground. Winter nights stretched endlessly. If summer darkness lasted only a few hours, winter's blackness would settle in for a long time, like an unwelcome relative who came to visit and forgot to leave. 16, 17, sometimes even 18 hours of darkness. Imagine sitting alone in a stone tower with the wind howling all around. The sea rumbled as if someone were banging on a giant drum, and your only company is the flickering flame of the lamp. No phone, no radio, no book, because reading in that light is impossible. The eyes tire quickly. It's just you, the light, and the night. Many keepers admitted that the first weeks on the lighthouse felt like hell. The silence pressed down on the ears. The loneliness became almost tangible, and thoughts started running in circles like a squirrel in a wheel. Welcome to Lectures Under the Moon. I'm Daniel Hayes, and today we'll explore the life of lighthouse keepers. Some people went mad. That is the truth. There were cases where lighthouse keepers were taken off the tower earlier than scheduled because they began talking to the lamp, counting waves, or writing long letters to non-existent recipients. But those who endured the loneliness changed, becoming calmer and wiser. They learned to listen to silence and understand that solitude was not a punishment, but simply another way of living. Sleep on the lighthouse was a special kind. It could hardly be called sleep in the usual sense. It was more like dozing, a half-sleep where consciousness didn't fully shut down, but slowed down, leaving one ear on alert. The keepers rested in short naps, half an hour here, 20 minutes there. Rarely could anyone afford a full 4 or 5 hours of uninterrupted rest. The lamp needed checking, the wick had to be adjusted, the glass cleaned of condensation. In winter, all this was complicated further by ice forming on the glass, which had to be carefully scraped away so the light wouldn't weaken. The lighthouse keeper's bedroom was usually located one level below the lantern room, a tiny chamber with a narrow bed, a stove, and a table that served multiple purposes: eating, recording in the log, and everything else. The bed was simple: a wooden frame, a mattress filled with straw or seaweed, a thick cloth blanket that smelled of smoke and dampness. If lucky, the pillow was made of bird feathers, but more often it was just a rolled-up cloth. Luxury was not fashionable on lighthouses. The main thing was warmth and dryness. Everything else was secondary. The stove was fueled with coal or firewood, depending on what was brought from the shore. Coal burned longer, but emitted acrid smoke that made the air thick and unpleasant. Firewood provided immediate warmth, but needed to be constantly replenished. Many keepers preferred a compromise, filling the stove with coal at night to keep some warmth until dawn, then using firewood during the day to warm up and dry their clothes. Humidity was a constant problem inside the lighthouse. The air, saturated with salt and water vapor, penetrated everywhere. Laundry took weeks to dry, shoes grew moldy, and metal objects rusted within days. Falling asleep to the sound of the sea was an art in itself. At first, it seemed impossible. The roar of waves, the whistle of the wind, the creaking of metal structures, all blended into a cacophony that made you want to cover your ears with a pillow. But over time, you got used to it. Moreover, you even began to miss that noise when in silence. An old lighthouse keeper once said that after 30 years on the tower, he moved to a village and couldn't sleep because of the silence. It was too quiet, too peaceful. He missed his roaring lullaby. There were small tricks, too. For example, some keepers would heat a brick on the stove, wrap it in cloth, and place it at their feet before sleeping. Such a makeshift heater kept warmth for 3 or 4 hours, making falling asleep with warm feet much easier. Others drank hot water with a drop of rum before bed, not to get drunk, but just to warm from the inside. Rum was part of the ship's provisions, and lighthouse keepers received it officially according to standard norms. The norm was a modest 50 grams a week, but even that seemed like a blessing. Interestingly, many keepers slept dressed, only removing their boots and jackets. They kept the rest on in case something happened during the night and they needed to get up quickly. Fires in lighthouses were rare but possible. The lamp could topple over, the wick ignite, the kerosene spill, and then every second counted. That's why readiness for disaster was part of life, even in sleep. Some lighthouse keepers kept a small notebook nearby, where they would record their dreams if they were vivid and memorable. Dreams at the lighthouse were unlike ordinary ones. The sea, the light, the solitude, all of these created a unique atmosphere where the subconscious worked differently. Some dreamt of ships sailing across the sky. Others saw enormous waves speaking in human voices. And some experienced nothing but silence, an endless white silence in which they longed to dissolve and forget everything. The morning didn't start with the clock, but with the light. When the sky outside began to pale, it signaled time to extinguish the lamp and record the report in the logbook. The night had passed peacefully, with a westward wind blowing at about 3 points. No ships crossed the horizon, and the light shone steadily. Short, businesslike phrases hid behind long hours of wakefulness, battling sleep and loneliness. After that, it was possible to go downstairs, stoke the fire, boil water for tea, and finally, truly lie down to sleep. 2 or 3 hours before noon was considered the lawful rest period, when no one had the right to disturb you, unless a storm was brewing, which often happened during winter. Sometimes these storms were so fierce that waves would completely engulf the lighthouse, making it seem as if the tower might tear away from its foundation and plunge into the depths below. During such moments, sleep was impossible. The keepers stood at the top, clutching the railing, watching to ensure the light kept burning, because, in these nights, it was needed most of all. Ships caught in the storm sought salvation, and the lighthouse became their last hope. Not seeing the light on such a night meant death. That's why the keepers did not sleep, no matter how long the storm raged, night, a whole day, or even 2. After such nights, they would fall asleep instantly, without changing out of their clothes, right on the floor by the stove. Their bodies simply shut down, like a burnt-out bulb. The sleep was deep, without dreams, resembling a little death. Yet even in such sleep, the subconscious kept watch. At the slightest change in sounds, if the wind shifted tone or the stove started to smoke, the keeper would wake up. The instinct for survival worked flawlessly. Thus, the winter months flowed between light and darkness, sleep and wakefulness, solitude and responsibility. The lighthouse lived its own life, and the person inside gradually became part of that life, silent, patient, faithful. When spring arrived and the ice began to melt, the keeper looked at the sea with different eyes. He knew things about it that no one on the shore did. He heard its breathing, saw its face in the darkness, fell asleep to its lullaby, and that made him a little wiser than everyone else. But that was only the beginning of the story. It would get more interesting when we peeked into the very bedroom itself. We would touch those hard mattresses and try to understand how one could sleep in a place where even the walls swayed from the wind. If today someone decided to open a hotel in an old lighthouse and offered tourists a night in the actual lighthouse keeper's room, few would probably be eager. It was too cramped, too damp, too cold, and, most importantly, too uncomfortable. Modern people are used to orthopedic mattresses, soft pillows, and heating that turns on at the flick of a switch. But Lighthouse X, and those built at the start of the 20th century, existed in conditions that now would seem medieval. Yet they managed not just to survive, but to sleep. Even if only in fragments, even if restlessly, they slept. The lighthouse's bedroom was arranged with maximum utilitarianism. No frills, no decorations. The rectangular room was roughly 3 meters in length and width, sometimes even smaller. The walls were made of bare stone or brick, coated with whitewash that, over time, had begun to peel and flake, leaving behind patches of dampness that resembled maps of unknown continents. During long, sleepless nights, the keepers would study these patches, imagining names for them. Over there is Greenland, and this one looks like Australia. The floor was constructed from thick wooden planks, soaked in salt from the sea and creaking loudly with every step. There was only one narrow window with thick glass, which in winter would frost from the inside and form a layer of ice on the outside. The bed was placed against the wall, away from the window, to avoid drafts. Typically, it was a simple wooden frame on 4 legs without headboards or adornments. Sometimes it was bolted directly to the wall, especially during fierce storms, to prevent it from sliding across the floor. Yes, even on solid ground, the lighthouse could sway when waves struck its base with particular fury, and on island or rocky lighthouses, it often felt as if one was sleeping on a rocking ship. Many keepers admitted that during the first week, they felt as if they were rocking on the ocean. Their heads spun, they felt nauseous, and all they wanted was solid, unmoving ground beneath their feet. Gradually, they adjusted, but those who failed to adapt often left. The mattress was either a source of pride or despair, depending on what the keeper had managed to obtain. At best, it was a burlap sack filled with dry straw. The straw crackled when shifted, but provided some softness. However, it had to be replaced regularly because dampness would cause it to clump, rot, and emit a heavy, foul smell instead of the pleasant aroma of hay. Replacing the straw on a lighthouse was no simple task. It had to be brought from the shore, and supplies arrived irregularly, prompting some keepers to devise clever tricks, stuffing their mattresses with seaweed. Seaweed was a contentious material.
On one hand, it was plentiful along the coast after every storm. Gather it, I don't want it. On the other hand, it smelled of the sea, iodine, and something else, an indefinable scent that could be called the spirit of the ocean floor. Its smell was persistent and pungent, yet the keepers claimed that one grew used to it, and even found it calming. Unlike straw, seaweed did not rot. It simply dried out and became stiffer. After a month or two, the mattress would turn into something resembling a lumpy board or a rough cushion. There were also exotic options. For example, in northern lighthouses, they sometimes used reindeer fur if they could find any, or sheep's wool. Sheep's wool kept warmth remarkably well, but absorbed moisture quickly and started to smell like wet dog. One keeper recalled stuffing his mattress with bird down collected from the cliffs where seagulls and cormorants nested. It was soft and warm, but within a week it became clear that feather mites had invaded the nest, the down along with tiny parasites. He had to throw everything away and sleep on bare planks until a new sack of straw was brought from the shore. The pillow was a story of its own. Ideally, it should have been filled with down or feathers, but such luxuries were almost impossible to obtain on a lighthouse. More often than not, the pillow was a rolled-up cloth or an old jacket. Some simply placed a bag of spare clothing under their head. It was firm, but at least it provided some support. One resourceful keeper even sewed himself a pillow from an old sailcloth bag, stuffing it with small twigs left over from firewood. He considered it better to have a prickly pillow than none at all, and he wrote to his family that it was a philosophical choice. The blanket was rarely a symbol of comfort either. Most often, it was an army-issue canvas, thick, grey, coarse, but warm. It weighed about 5 kilograms, and sleeping beneath it was like lying under a heavy press, yet it kept the cold away. Some lighthouse keepers used 2 blankets. One was spread under themselves, while the other was used as a cover on top. This created insulation both from below and above, because the cold came not only from the window, but also from the stone floor and the walls. Sleeping in such a sandwich was a little stifling, but at least you wouldn't freeze. An interesting detail, beds on the lighthouses often leaned at an angle. Not intentionally, of course, just because the floors were uneven. Lighthouses were built on rocky outcroppings, on irregular ground. Over time, the foundations settled unevenly, causing the floors to slope at angles of several degrees. It might seem insignificant, but imagine trying to sleep on a bed tilted at even 3 or 4 degrees. you'd constantly slide toward the wall, or conversely be pushed toward the edge. Wake up and find yourself no longer in the same spot where you fell asleep. Some keepers would wedge stones or wooden blocks under the bed legs to level the angle. Others simply got used to it and learned to sleep like sailors on a rolling ship, one hand gripping the edge of the bed to steady themselves. The stove was the heart of life in the sleeping quarters. Usually it was a small cast iron stove with a door and a pipe leading out through the wall or ceiling. They fueled it with coal if they had any, or wood if they managed to gather some. Coal provided steady, even heat, but produced acrid smoke and black soot that coated everything in a thin layer of ash. Burning wood was more cheerful, but required a lot, and supplies didn't last long. Therefore, the keepers learned to heat sparingly. Before bed, they would thoroughly warm the room, then close the damper and let the coals smolder slowly through the night. This kept the heat until morning. The problem was that the stove heated the room unevenly. It was so hot around it that standing nearby was impossible, while in the corner by the window, the temperature stayed close to freezing.
Water in a cup on the table would form a thin ice film, and breath turned to steam in the cold air. Because of this, the bed was placed at an optimal distance from the stove, close enough to stay warm, but not so close as to get suffocated by the heat, yet not so far as to freeze. Each keeper found this balance through experience, trial, and many sleepless nights. Linen on the lighthouse was rare. Sheets, pillowcases, these were considered luxuries. Linen had to be washed, but there was nowhere to wash on the lighthouse, and no water to spare. Fresh water was worth its weight in gold, brought in barrels from the shore or collected from rain. Wasting it on laundry was deemed foolish, so most keepers slept directly on a rough canvas mattress, covered with a woolen blanket, with their head resting on a rolled-up piece of clothing. Hygiene was Spartan. They bathed infrequently, changed clothes even less often. One keeper noted in a journal, "In 3 months on the lighthouse, I changed my shirt twice. When I arrived on the coast, my wife didn't recognize me by my smell." The window in the sleeping quarters was usually covered with something thick and old, a blanket, burlap, or even newspapers, not so much to block out the light as to insulate. The glass was thin, and cold seeped through it. Covering the window raised the room's temperature by a few degrees. It made the space darker, but darkness was a normal part of life on the lighthouse. During the day, the keeper worked upstairs in the lantern room, where there was plenty of light. The bedroom was only for sleeping, and artificial light wasn't needed there. The furniture was minimal. Besides the bed, there was a rough table made from planks, a single wooden chair that wobbled, a shelf on the wall for books and personal items, hooks for clothing, and a small chest for provisions that also served as a bench. Sometimes, an old trunk stored spare clothes, tools, and kerosene. Everything reeked of dampness, smoke, and sea air, permeating every surface and object. If you were to step into such a room now, your first impression would be one of poverty. But for the lighthouse keepers, it was a home, the only one they had for many months. Sometimes the walls of the bedroom were decorated. Not with paintings, of course. What paintings are there on a lighthouse? But with photographs of family, cutouts from old newspapers, postcards. Someone nailed up a calendar with nails, crossing out each day as it passed, counting down to the shift change. Someone drew patterns, diagrams, simple doodles with charcoal or chalk on the wall. It was a way to preserve sanity, to leave a mark, to remind oneself that they were human, not just part of the lighthouse's machinery. At night, when the wind howled outside and the fire crackled, the keeper would remove their frozen boots and place them by the fire. They would tighten the damp jacket, hang it on a hook,
lie down on a hard mattress, cover themselves with a heavy blanket, and listen to the sea crashing against the rocks. They would fall asleep to this monotonous rhythm, knowing that in a few hours they would have to get up, check the light, tend the wick, record data in the logbook, then lie down again and get up again. Round after round, night after night, winter after winter. Yet, strangely, many of these men and women later recalled their life on the lighthouse with warmth. Yes, it was cold. Yes, uncomfortable. Yes, lonely. But there, in the stone bedroom, beneath a rough blanket, they were free. Free from fuss, from other voices, from the need to pretend. There, they could be themselves and sleep how they could. Whether in fragments or on a hard cot with a tilt, they could sleep under the protection of stone walls, knowing that their light was shining and saving someone. As for how these people divided the night into shifts, and what happened to their sleep when watch was continuous, we will discuss that further. The human body is built cleverly. It prefers routine, waking at the same time, sleeping, eating on schedule, biological clocks, circadian rhythms, all functioning like a well-oiled machine, until they start to break down. And life on a lighthouse broke that mechanism from day one, because there was no concept of going to bed at 10 in the evening and waking at 7 in the morning. There was a watch, a shift, duty, and sleep had to fit into the gaps between tending the fire. On larger lighthouses, where 2 or 3 keepers served, the schedule was strict. The night was divided into parts. One kept watch for 4 hours, the other slept. Then they switched. It sounds logical, but try living like that for at least a week. Falling asleep at midnight, and at 4 in the morning, it's time for your watch. You stand duty until 8, then you can nap again. But by then, your body is thoroughly confused. Should I sleep or stay awake? The brain tries to figure out if it's morning or night, and the body demands some regularity. It doesn't get it, and begins to rebel. The first sign that the routine has broken down is vivid dreams on the eve. Standing by the lantern, staring into the darkness, and suddenly seeing a ship with lights on the masts, clear and bright. You wipe your eyes, and there's no one there. The sea is empty. Or hearing voices, as if someone is calling your name. Turning around, only the wind. This isn't magic. It's simply a tired brain's work, starting to confuse sleep and reality. Medical professionals call it hypnagogic hallucinations. The keepers called it simpler, hallucinatory episodes caused by insomnia. In lighthouse logs, there are amusing entries. On the night from December 15th to 16th, Semyonov was on duty, saw lights on the horizon, and recorded a passing vessel. In the morning, it turned out that the star he saw was low in the sky. Or he heard music, searched for a gramophone. There's no gramophone on the lighthouse. Some keepers kept double records, an official one for the authorities and a personal one for themselves. In his private journal, he wrote honestly, "Once again, these damn voices are back. I really need to get some sleep." But rest was impossible. The hardest part was on the solitary lighthouses, where the keeper served alone. There was no one to share the watch with. He had to invent his own routines. Some would sleep for 20 minutes every 2 hours, a method that would later be called polyphasic sleep and recommended to entrepreneurs for boosting productivity. But the keepers weren't thinking about efficiency. They simply tried not to collapse from exhaustion. After 20 minutes of sleep, he'd climb upstairs to check the fire, make sure everything was in order, then come back down and lie down again.
and he would repeat this cycle all night long. Others divided the night into halves, staying fully alert during the first half, then dozing off beside the lamp on a special bench in the second. It was risky, since oversleeping could mean missing something vital, but the trade-off was a few hours of relatively uninterrupted rest. Still, such sleep was superficial and restless. The slightest noise, the faintest change in the wind's whistle, and the keeper would startle awake, clutching the railing, checking the wick. There were a few who managed to sleep almost not at all, having trained themselves to survive on just 3 or 4 hours of sleep per day and feeling fine. One such keeper served at a northern lighthouse for 12 years and claimed he had never slept longer than 3 hours in a row during that entire time. "I got used to it," he said. "Now I can't do it any other way."
If I try to sleep for 5 hours, I wake up with a headache and the feeling that life has passed me by. His colleagues considered him either a saint or slightly touched. Probably both at once. Their daytime sleep had its own peculiarities. It might seem simple. After a night shift, go to bed in the morning when the sun has just risen and sleep peacefully. But at the lighthouse, daytime rest was a rare luxury. During the day, they had to tend to the household, clean the lantern equipment, polish the lenses, check the mechanisms, keep records, prepare food, stoke the stove, and repair anything that had broken overnight. Fully sleeping through the day was seldom achieved. Usually, it was just brief naps. An hour after breakfast, half an hour before lunch, then another hour afterward. Interestingly, many keepers noted that daytime naps at the lighthouse were strange, far more vivid and surreal than the nighttime ones. This was probably because, biologically, humans are creatures of the daytime, and when they fell asleep against their natural rhythms, their subconscious would conjure bizarre images. They dreamed of inverted ships sailing upside down, of the lighthouse detaching from the earth and floating on the sea like an enormous candle, or of water pouring out instead of light from the lamp. One keeper kept a detailed journal of a series of recurring dreams. He dreamed he was climbing a staircase that seemed endless. No matter how far he went, the lantern room never drew closer. The stairs became narrower and steeper, and at some point, he realized he was no longer inside the tower, but outside it, spiraling around the lighthouse with the dark sea beneath. A single misstep, and he'd fall. He would wake up in a cold sweat, unable to calm his racing heart for a long time. Then he'd fall back asleep and find himself on the same endless staircase. Falling dreams were frequent, probably because the lighthouse is a vertical space where the risk of falling always exists. The narrow steps, the steep passages, the dizzying height of the lantern room, all of this seeped into their subconscious and appeared in their dreams. Some dreamed of falling from the top of the lighthouse, flying through the air, the land never drawing nearer. They'd wake just before hitting the ground, heart pounding, breathing ragged, lying still for several minutes to recover. Some lighthouse keepers, trying to stay calm and steady their heartbeat, would analyze their dreams, searching for signs within them. If they dreamed of a bright light, it meant the weather would improve. If darkness and storms appeared, they knew a tempest was coming. Of course, it was largely wishful thinking. But in conditions of complete isolation, any hint of meaning felt incredibly significant. They kept a journal of their dreams, comparing them to the reality outside. Sometimes the dreams matched, but more often they did not. Yet the act of recording helped organize the chaos in their minds, creating an illusion of control over their circumstances. Occasionally, they experienced bright, nearly joyful dreams about home, about family, about a warm hearth. They saw a wife setting a hot bowl of soup on the table, children running toward them with laughter, a dog joyfully jumping at their feet.
Waking from such dreams, the lighthouse keeper felt a sharp pang of longing, a deep ache, because they would open their eyes and see only bare stone walls, hear the howling wind, and feel the cold seeping through the blanket. They understood with quiet certainty that there were still weeks, perhaps months, to go before their shift ended. To cope with this stark divide between sleep and reality, some keepers came up with rituals. Before sleep, they would always drink a mug of hot water, look at a photograph of their family, or read aloud a short prayer.
It didn't have to be a religious prayer. Sometimes they simply spoke in their own words. Let me live until morning. Let me stay awake until the end. Let me return home. These rituals served as talismans, helping them avoid completely losing themselves in the chaos of insomnia and loneliness. Their schedules changed with the seasons. In winter, when nights stretched long and dark, the workload increased. They had to keep the fire burning for 16 or 17 hours straight, which meant they only had about 5 or 6 hours for sleep, often broken into fragments. Summers were easier. The nights were short, the days long, and there was more time for rest. But in winter, every hour of sleep was precious, almost begged for. Interestingly, over time, the body adapted. After a few months at the lighthouse, the keeper would fall asleep instantly, slipping into unconsciousness without struggle. There were no tossings or thoughts before sleep, just a body that understood the value of each moment and had to make the most of it. An internal timer seemed to activate. They would sleep exactly as much as they could, then wake up on their own without an alarm. Many, after returning to normal life, retained this ability to fall asleep anywhere and wake up precisely at the right time. Yet, there was a dark side. After months of irregular schedules, some keepers found they could no longer return to normal sleep patterns. They would lie down at their usual time, but would wake up in the middle of the night automatically, driven by habit. They would get up, wander through the house, unsure of what to do. Their wives would complain that they moved like ghosts, checking windows, gazing at the sky as if waiting for ships to appear, an almost professional deformation that was nearly impossible to undo. Sleeping on the lighthouse had become more than just a physiological need. It was a form of escape. It was a brief vacation from reality, a short respite from responsibility, a chance, however fleeting, to stop being a guardian of the light. In dreams, they could be anyone: fishermen, farmers, travelers. They could find themselves in a warm house by the fireplace, with a book in hand. They could forget about the cold, the loneliness, the endless roar of the waves. That's why they cherished sleep so fiercely, valuing every minute of it. Sleep was also the only time when the lighthouse keeper was not fully in control of himself. During the day and night, he had to stay alert, responsible for every action, mindful of his duty. But in sleep, he was free. Even if that freedom lasted only 20 minutes, even if it was filled with strange images and anxious visions, it still existed. And upon waking, the lighthouse keeper would feel a flicker of disappointment. Disappointed that the brief respite was over, longing to return to that elusive moment of peace, however fragile or fleeting. Once again, it was reality. Another shift. Another endless cycle. Yet the cycle persisted. Rising from bed, climbing the steep, creaking steps, checking the flame, recording the readings, then descending back down, only to lie down again and get up once more. The routine, which would have broken an ordinary person within a month, became normal, became life itself. Somewhere on the border between sleep and wakefulness, between the flickering light of the lighthouse and the darkness outside the window, a peculiar state would emerge. Not quite sleep, not quite wakefulness, but something in between. A state of eternal vigil, where you were simultaneously here and somewhere far away. Strangely, in this condition, even the simplest sensations heightened. Hunger, for instance, ceased to be merely a physical need and became an obsession, a distraction from the constant watch. With an empty stomach, falling asleep was impossible. The body demanded fuel. But having too much was equally bad. Heaviness prevented rest, and dreams turned into nightmares. Therefore, lighthouse keepers quickly learned how to balance what to eat, when to eat, and how much, in order to survive until the next shift and at least get some decent sleep. Food became part of the ritual of preparing for sleep, as important as checking the fuel or recording the log. Each person had their own tricks, their own recipes, their small pleasures that helped them endure yet another endless winter night. If you asked anyone what helped them fall asleep, many would mention warm milk with honey or a glass of kefir before bed. Some would talk about chamomile tea, others about a shot of brandy. Everyone had their routines, their proven methods to lull their body into rest. But all of this only worked when there was a choice. When the house was full of cold, when the store could be visited at any moment, when the stove on the kitchen was fueled with gas and hot water flowed from the tap. Now imagine, you are on a lighthouse in the middle of the winter sea. Supplies were delivered 2 months ago. The next shipment was uncertain when it would arrive, and everything you have fits into 2 wooden boxes. From this, you had to compose your menu before sleep. Supplies to lighthouse stations were brought infrequently, once a month if the weather was favorable, once every 2 months if it was not. In winter, there were times when the keeper was cut off from the shore for half a year. Ice prevented boats from reaching, and there were never enough icebreakers to service every lighthouse. That's why the food had to last long and resist moisture and spoilage. Dried bread, salted meat, grains, dried fish, canned foods. Nothing fresh. Vegetables and fruits at the lighthouse were a luxury remembered with longing. Dried bread was the staple of the diet. Not the soft, crispy croutons sold now in small packets with various flavors, but real maritime dried bread. Hard as stone, bland, about the size of a palm. It was baked specifically for long storage, dried until no moisture remained. Biting into such a dry cracker was almost impossible. The teeth simply could not withstand it. So they soaked it in water, tea, soup, anything. Once soaked, the bread became soft and edible, but it lost its particular flavor. Still, at the lighthouse, no one complained about taste. The main concern was filling the stomach and avoiding poisoning. Salted meat was the second essential staple for lighthouse workers, usually beef or pork packed in barrels. It contained so much salt that the first-timer trying it would grimace and spit it out. But it was necessary. Without such a high salt content, the meat would spoil within a week. Before cooking, the salted meat was soaked in water for hours, changing the water several times to reduce some of the salt. Then it was boiled slowly and thoroughly until the meat became tender. A thick, hearty broth was always prepared, one that was consumed hot or used as a base for porridge. Porridge served as dinner, breakfast, and lunch, all at once, depending on what was available. They cooked it from whatever grains they had, oatmeal, barley, or millet, sometimes on water, sometimes using that very meat broth. Sugar was rarely added, kept carefully, and butter was also reserved. The resulting mass was bland and thick, eaten with a spoon, often washed down with hot water or tea. It might sound unappetizing, but after 12 hours exposed to cold wind, with numb hands and an empty stomach, such porridge felt like a delicacy. Its primary purpose was warmth, warming from the inside, giving strength, and, importantly, helping to fall asleep. A full stomach calmed the nerves better than any sleeping pill. Fish at the lighthouse was almost always available. When the lighthouse stood on the coast or on an island, the keepers would sometimes fish in their free time, casting a line or setting a net and waiting patiently. The catch was unpredictable, sometimes a flounder, sometimes cod, herring, or occasionally nothing at all. But when luck was on their side, they would immediately prepare the fish. They boiled it, fried it in a pan if they had enough oil, or simply baked it in the oven, wrapped in a damp cloth. Fresh fish at the lighthouse was a real celebration. They ate it slowly, with relish, savoring each bite, and saved the leftover salt, or dried some for a black day. Dried fish hung in the bedroom, suspended from ropes beneath the ceiling. It was tough, salty, and carried the scent of the sea and thyme. Before bed, when craving a snack, the keeper would tear off a piece, chew it slowly, and think of something personal. This was less a meal than a form of meditation. The monotonous chewing calmed the mind, distracted from anxious thoughts, and helped induce sleep. Still, after such a snack, the desire to drink water was intense. The salt worked its magic, and one had to get up, pour a glass, drink, and then lie back down. Some keepers refused to eat dried fish at night for this very reason. They found it exhausting to keep getting up. Canned foods appeared at the lighthouse near the end of the 19th century and proved to be a real salvation. Canned stews, fish preserves, sometimes vegetables, these metal jars could be stored for months, impervious to dampness and cold. Opening a can was almost a ritual. They would pierce the lid with a knife, pry off the metal, breathe in the aroma, and for a moment it felt as though they were not at the edge of the world, but somewhere in normal life, where factories, shops, and civilization existed. They ate the stew directly from the can, scooping it with a piece of dry bread, or heated it on the stove, mixing it into their porridge. It was hearty and delicious by the standards of lighthouse life. Tea was a constant companion. They drank it unpretentiously, sometimes the simple brick-like pressed leaves resembling dark bricks, or a more refined jasmine tea imported from distant lands. They would break off a piece, steep it in boiling water, and drink it hot, burning their tongues. Tea served many purposes. It warmed, invigorated, calmed, and filled the silence during long shifts. It was drunk before starting the watch, during the watch, after, and before bed. Sometimes, if sugar was available, they added a little. The tea was sipped slowly, a piece of sugar held in the cheek while they drew from their mug, allowing the sweetness to dissolve gradually, saving sugar and making the tea taste sweeter. Sugar was a rare and precious commodity. It was issued according to a strict ration, meant to last for a month or even longer. Some keepers would forego sugar in their tea altogether, saving it for times of sickness or deep loneliness. Because a small piece of slowly melting sugar was a tiny joy, a reminder of a sweeter life. When the sugar ran out, they simply drank the tea plain, bitter, astringent, but still hot. In especially tough nights, the keepers would add a drop of rum or spirits to their tea. Officially, alcohol was provided as part of the lighthouse staff's provisions, intended to warm and support health during long, cold nights. In reality, these were tiny doses, no more than 50 grams a week, but even those small amounts were highly valued. Rum was added to tea before bedtime, not to get drunk, but to relax. The warmth would spread through the body, Muscles would soften from tension, and falling asleep became easier. The main rule was not to get carried away, because a drunken lighthouse keeper would be a disaster. The flame demanded a clear mind. There were also some truly strange recipes. For example, hot water with a spoonful of lard. The lard was melted in a pan, the fat poured into a cup of boiling water, a pinch of salt added, and then drunk. Afterward, a person would feel heated, eager to lie down and cover up with something warm. Sleep would come quickly. Another old tradition was having soup before bed. It was made from whatever was at hand: a piece of salted meat, a handful of grains, dried fish, water. The ingredients would be boiled on the stove for an hour or an hour and a half until everything disintegrated into a uniform, thick mass. The resulting broth was rich and hearty, eaten slowly with small spoons, sipped carefully while warming the hands around a hot mug. The soup filled the stomach, warmed the body, and often triggered a strong desire to sleep afterward. Some lighthouse keepers claimed that the main thing in lighthouse cooking is not taste, but temperature. The hotter, the better the sleep. Bread was a rarity on the lighthouse. Flour was brought in, but baking bread in such a constantly damp environment was difficult. The dough wouldn't rise well, the crust wouldn't crackle, and the crumb would turn out soft and dense, so they often baked something more like flatbreads. Simple dough made from flour, water, and salt, rolled thin and fried on a pan or baked in the oven. These flatbreads were eaten hot while still soft. The next day they would harden and become as dry as croutons. Still, a fresh flatbread with a piece of salted meat or a spoonful of porridge seemed a real delicacy. Lighthouse keepers also had their superstitions involving food. For instance, it was believed that one should never eat fish with the head facing east during a storm, or that the last dry bread in a bag had to be shared with the sea, half thrown overboard out of the window, to ensure that the sea would stay calm and that the next supply would arrive on time. Some would leave a piece of bread or a dry cracker on the table for a household spirit, even though there was no such spirit on the lighthouse. It was simply a tradition, a ritual, a way to feel connected to something greater than oneself. Please like and subscribe to Lectures Under the Moon for more fascinating stories. Cooking at the lighthouse was straightforward and quick. No culinary experiments, no sauces or spices. Just throw ingredients into a pot, pour in water, set it on the stove, and wait until it's done. There was little time for preparation, and often little desire for elaborate meals. Food was perceived purely as fuel, something to fill the stomach, warm the body, and give strength to endure until the next shift. Interestingly, many lighthouse keepers, after leaving the lighthouse, could no longer enjoy refined dishes. They returned to ordinary life, where their wives prepared festive meals, and everything seemed overwhelming. Too much flavor, too many spices, too complicated. They grew accustomed to simplicity: porridge, dry bread, tea, and that simplicity was enough to bring happiness. One former keeper once said, "The best food is that which allows you to sleep peacefully afterward. Everything else is just indulgence. A snack before bed is a crucial moment. Eating too much, you're tossing and turning, your stomach keeps you awake. Going to bed starving isn't good either. You'll wake up in the middle of the night with a growling stomach and weakness. You need a golden mean." Some would eat a handful of leftover porridge from dinner. Others would gnaw on a soaked dry cracker, while some drank a mug of broth. Everyone found their own method through trial and error, all in silence, alone, illuminated only by the dim glow of a kerosene lamp. You sit at the table, chewing on a dinner that's warm but unpleasant. Outside, the wind howls fiercely, the stove creaks under the strain, and the sea pounds relentlessly against the rocks. Your thoughts drift to home, to family. You imagine that somewhere, at the very edge of the world, people are sleeping in warm beds, covered by soft blankets, unaware that just over the horizon, someone is watching the light and eating cold porridge from a battered tin bowl. These moments, when your stomach is full, your body weary, and there is still time before the next shift begins, the lighthouse keepers take out their letters. Old, well-read to the point of fragility, with faded ink and smudged lines. Letters from wives, from children, from friends. They read them over and over, finding comfort and strength in familiar words, and they write long, detailed, honest replies that may take months to reach their loved ones, or might never arrive at all if a storm interferes. But that didn't matter. What mattered was writing, speaking to someone, even if that someone was thousands of miles away. The strangest thing about serving at the lighthouse was not even the loneliness itself, but the length of it. Being alone for a week was almost an adventure. A month was a test. 3 months. That was the boundary where something else began. People are built so that they need voices, faces, touches. Without these, they start to dry out from within, like a sponge left in the sun. And the only way to nourish the soul with human warmth was through letters. Sheets of paper with faded ink, carrying the scent of home, holding the warmth of strangers' hands, reminding you, out there, across the sea, you are remembered. Mail arrived at the lighthouse irregularly. In theory, once every 2 months, along with provisions and kerosene. In practice, whenever it could. In winter, ice could cut the lighthouse off for half a year. Storms kept ships stranded for weeks. Sometimes, a batch of letters would arrive, 10 at once, written over 3 months. They had to be read in order, to follow the course of life, to keep events straight. The keeper would lay out the envelopes by date, like cards before a game of solitaire, and begin reading slowly, savoring each word, stretching out the pleasure. Letters from a wife were usually long, written in tiny handwriting on both sides of the paper. They kept the paper carefully, writing densely, squeezing words between lines and without margins. Reading such letters was difficult. You had to squint, bring the paper close to the lamp, decipher each word. But it didn't irritate. On the contrary, the longer you read, the longer the joy lasted. The wives wrote about everyday life, about the children, the neighbors, the weather, about the cow having calved, a roof that had leaked, the youngest child starting school. Ordinary, simple things that, at the lighthouse, seemed magical because they represented real, warm, living life. Letters from children were brief and crooked. Letters of varying size, with mistakes, sometimes with little drawings in the margins. A house, a tree, the sun, a cat. The keeper could gaze at these drawings for hours, finding in their clumsy scribbles something endlessly touching. "When will you come home?" Mum asks. "Soon. I'm waiting." Short lines that tighten the heart. "Will you come? When? In a month? 2 months? Half a year?" It's impossible to know. It depends on the weather, on the shift, on the orders from above. And the child waits, every day, watching the road, waiting. There were letters that arrived far too late. Written in October, they arrived in March. In that time, many things could have changed. Someone might have fallen ill, died. Someone else might have been born. And you read about events from 5 months earlier, knowing that everything there has already changed, but not knowing exactly how. That uncertainty was tormenting. You longed to know instantly what was happening now, how they were, if everything was all right. But there was no instant communication, only letters that drifted across the sea slowly, like icebergs. Responding to letters was a ritual of its own. Usually, in the evening before sleep, after the day's tasks were done and before the night watch, the lighthouse keeper would sit at the table, take out a sheet of paper, clean, smooth, reserved for an important occasion, dip a feather into the inkwell, and fall silent. Where to begin? How to tell of a life that consisted of the same cycle: wind, waves, light, sleep? How not to scare, upset, or cause even more worry? The letters were written in a vague, careful manner. I'm doing fine. The service is proceeding as usual. The weather is changeable, but I hold on. Take care of yourself and the children. Sending a tight hug. But some keepers wrote honestly, long and detailed letters, pouring out everything they had accumulated. About how difficult it was to sleep in snatches, about how the wind howled and it felt as if one might go insane, about how desperately they wanted to hear a human voice, any voice, even if it was unfamiliar, about how tired they were of salted meat and dry bread, how exhausted they were from the endless sea that never truly falls silent. They knew that letters might never reach their destination. Storms, shipwrecks, simply losing the way, anything could happen. But they wrote anyway, because the act of writing itself was calming, a way to speak out, even if only to paper. Rereading old letters became a habit. When new ones didn't arrive, they'd take out the old, well-worn, with creased folds, and read them again and again, memorizing every word. Some knew certain letters by heart, yet they would read them repeatedly, not for information, but for a sense of closeness. The handwriting of a wife, carefully penned, kept the warmth of her presence alive, as if she were nearby, leaning over the table, forming words. It was almost like having a conversation, almost like not being alone. Besides letters from family, there were also notes from friends, fellow sailors, even strangers. Sometimes, a sailor whose ship had been saved by the lighthouse's beam would send a thank you letter. These messages were especially treasured because they carried meaning, proof that the service was not in vain, that the light had saved someone, that the keeper was needed. Such letters were kept separate, reread in moments of despair. When everything seemed pointless and no one cared anymore, there were keepers who kept diaries, not official logs with weather reports and ship movements, but personal journals, thoughts, observations, feelings. Some wrote daily, others only when emotions overflowed. The style varied widely. Some kept dry, factual entries. Others composed entire philosophical treatises about the meaning of life, the sea, the light, and the silence. These diaries were never read by anyone but their authors. They served as confessions without a priest, conversations with oneself, and sometimes with God, if one believed. One keeper recorded dreams. Every morning he woke up and immediately reached for his pen, trying to capture what he saw before it faded. He described in detail what he had experienced: colors, sounds, scents, the feelings and images. Over a year, he filled an entire notebook with strange, surreal stories. Ships transforming into birds, a lighthouse sailing across the sky, a sea made of liquid light. Later, back on land, he showed this notebook to an acquaintance who was a doctor. The doctor shook his head. Loneliness and lack of sleep were classic symptoms. But the lighthouse keeper didn't care. He knew those dreams were part of his life, and in their own way, they felt real. Another keeper kept a weather journal, but not a formal one, an emotional record. Instead of noting temperature and wind direction, he wrote about how the weather affected his mood. Today the sea was calm as a mirror. The silence pressed on the ears. He longed for even a small wave to splash, for the wind to blow a little. In such quiet, you could hear your own heartbeat. And that was frightening. Or maybe it was the third day of a storm. I've grown tired of being afraid. Now I simply watch the waves crash against the walls and think, if everything is destined to collapse, then it will. Resisting makes no sense. Reading these kinds of notes means touching the inner world of someone who hasn't seen others for months. Before sleep, many lighthouse keepers would take out photographs, small cards, worn from frequent handling, a wife in a Sunday dress, children on the porch of the house, the whole family together. He himself, young and still unwearied by the lighthouse, stands in the center, embracing his wife over her shoulders. These photographs were placed beside the bed so that the last thing you saw before falling asleep was a familiar face. Sleeping like that made it easier, as if he was not alone in a stone tower in the middle of the sea, but at home, in warmth, in safety. Sometimes the keepers would speak to the photographs aloud, as if talking to real people. Here's your wife. Today there was another storm. Thought the roof would blow off, but it held. Don't worry, I'm strong. I'll endure. Just take care of yourself there. Don't catch a cold. From an outsider's perspective, it looked like madness. But when there's no one around, talking to a photograph becomes a way to keep the skill of speech alive. Because there were cases when keepers, after 6 months of solitude, forgot how to speak properly. They'd return to the shore and struggle to find words, stammering, whispering instead of talking normally. Their vocal cords had grown unused to working. Prayer before sleep was also a form of conversation. Not necessarily with God, many didn't believe, but with something higher, something incomprehensible that helped them survive another night. Give me strength. Give me patience. Let me see the shift. Let me return home. Simple words, repeated like a mantra, calmed them, gave the feeling that they weren't entirely alone, that somewhere there was a force listening and perhaps helping. Reading before sleep was a luxury not available to everyone. Books on the lighthouse were rare, heavy, took up space, often damaged by moisture. But if a keeper could read, and had at least one book, he cherished it like a treasure, reread it dozens of times, memorized whole pages. Usually it was the Bible, or a collection of poems, or some adventure novel. They read in the dim light of a lamp, squinting, straining their eyes. More than a few pages at a time was too much for their sight. Yet those pages transported them thousands of miles away, to other worlds, other lives, and made falling asleep easier. Memories before sleep were inevitable. Lying on the hard cot, wrapped in a rough blanket, the keeper would close his eyes and recall how he met his wife, how their first child was born, how they built the house, how they planted an apple tree in the garden, how they gathered mushrooms in the forest. Small details that seemed insignificant in everyday life gained weight here, on the lighthouse, turning into treasures. Every memory was a gem to be held and revisited again and again. Some keepers were afraid to remember, because memories could bring sadness, and sadness made sleep impossible. Lying with open eyes, recalling the scent of a pie his wife baked, the laughter of children, the creak of the gate, and realizing that all of that was gone now. There were only cold walls, the howling wind, and loneliness. The contrast made their hearts tighten so painfully that they felt like howling. So they tried not to remember, or to remember selectively. Only the good, only the bright moments, without details that could wound. There were also those who deliberately cultivated memories, creating whole worlds in their minds where they could live parallel to reality.
They would close their eyes and imagine, "Here I am at home, sitting by the stove, children playing on the floor, wife preparing dinner." They sank so deeply into this imaginary world that they could almost smell the scents, hear the sounds, and feel as if they were truly there. It was a kind of meditation, a defense mechanism of the mind. Without it, many simply wouldn't have endured. Interestingly, many lighthouse keepers admitted that the hardest time wasn't the storm, the cold, or the hunger. The most difficult part was the evening before sleep. When the day's work was done, the watch hadn't yet begun, and there were a few hours left for reflection. That was when loneliness would hit with such force that it felt like screaming. During those moments, they would take out letters, look at photographs, pray, read, or remember anything, just to avoid being left alone with emptiness. Falling asleep after such an evening was strange. On one side, you were exhausted and eager to switch off, but on the other, you didn't want to let go of those ghostly ties to home, those fleeting connections restored for a moment through letters and memories. So, falling asleep stretched out. You lie there, staring at the ceiling, thinking, listening to the crackling of the stove, to the wind howling outside, and gradually, very slowly, you begin to let go. You drift into a sleep where perhaps you'll see your home, your family, warmth, or maybe only darkness. But sometimes, sleep simply wouldn't come at all. Despite the fatigue, despite the irregular schedule and lack of rest, the body would suddenly refuse to sleep. You lay there for an hour, 2, 3, eyes wide open, brain working at full speed, body tense. Insomnia at the lighthouse was almost normal. And the scariest part was that there was nothing to fight it with. No doctor, no medication, no chance to take a walk, to clear your mind, to distract yourself. It was only you, your bunk, and the endless night. And when dawn finally broke, you would get up, exhausted, with red eyes, knowing deep down, today will be especially tough. The nights that were the most frightening were those when the gaslight was on. When the mechanism broke, the wick tore, the oil ran out, or the storm raged so fiercely that the lenses cracked. Then the lighthouse plunged into complete, utter darkness, and the keeper was left alone with that darkness, knowing that somewhere out at sea, a ship might be sailing, waiting for its light, and it wouldn't get it. There are things a lighthouse worker must prevent at all costs. The first of these is an extinguished light, because a lighthouse without a light is just a tall, lifeless stone tower, meaningless and dead. All its purpose hinges on that tiny flame flickering in the darkness, signaling to sailors, "Here is the coast, here is danger. Keep away or follow the course." Without the lighthouse becomes a traitor. Instead of warning, it remains silent, and silence in the sea kills. Every keeper knew that if the light went out because of their fault, it was a catastrophe. Not just professionally, but morally as well. The reasons for a light to go out varied. The most common was simply running out of kerosene. How could one allow that? Every evening you refilled the lamp, checked the level, calculated the supplies. But sometimes things went wrong. Supplies could be delayed for a month or two. The kerosene could run out sooner than expected. Perhaps the cold consumed it faster, or the wick was wound too high. And then came the moment when the keeper would go up to the lantern room and see the reservoir nearly empty, and 6 hours until dawn. Panic-driven conservation would begin. The wick would be lowered to its minimum, and the light would grow dim, but still burn. Falling asleep on such a night was impossible. You would sit beside the lamp, watch every drop, pray it would last until morning. Breakdowns were even more terrifying.
The mechanism that rotated the lenses could jam, springs could snap, gears could break, parts could rust from constant humidity, and then repairs had to be made right there in the dark, with cold, numb fingers that refused to obey. Every moment was a struggle, a fight against the darkness, the cold, the silence, and the fear that the light might fail altogether. The lighthouse keeper was transforming into a watchmaker, carefully dismantling the mechanism, searching for the fault. He tried to replace a part, or at least temporarily secure it, but the light was out. The lamp was burning, yet the lenses refused to rotate, so the beam was only directed in one direction. Half the horizon remained in darkness. Somewhere out there, a ship could be sailing, its captain waiting for flashes of light at precise intervals, but he would never see them. The filament might break at any moment, causing an instantaneous catastrophe. The lamp burned steadily, flickering as it should, when suddenly there was a sharp snap. The filament broke. The flame extinguished, and the room was plunged into darkness. An experienced lighthouse keeper always kept a spare filament nearby for such emergencies. Replacing it in the dark, with trembling hands from fear and cold, when every passing second could mean the difference between life and death, was no easy task. He struck a match, then another, then a third. His fingers refused to obey, and the matches often went out from the wind slipping through the cracks. Finally, he managed to light a new filament. The light returned, allowing him to breathe again. A storm could shatter the glass of the lantern room. Waves, rising to incredible heights, sometimes completely engulfed the lighthouse. The water pounded the windows with such force that the glass cracked and shattered, flying outward. The wind howled inside, threatening to blow out the flame. Large hailstones, about the size of a chicken egg, battered the roof and the glass, smashing through them. At such moments, the keeper would rush to patch the holes with whatever he could find: rags, planks, even his own coat. The main goal was to prevent the wind from snuffing out the flame. He stood by the lamp, shielding it with his body, soaked, freezing, yet refusing to give up, because if he did, the light would go out. In winter, snow could cover the lenses from the outside so thoroughly that the light could not pierce the thick layer of ice. Officially, the lamp was still burning, but it was useless. The beam barely reached a meter. The only solution was to step out onto the gallery, the open platform surrounding the lantern room, even in the middle of a blizzard. There, at heights of 23 or even 40 meters, with wind powerful enough to blow a person over like a feather, he would cling with one hand to the railing while scraping the ice off the glass with a paperclip in the other. His fingers would freeze to the cold metal, and his face burned from the icy needles. But he had to work fast before he froze completely. He cleaned one section, then hurried inside to warm up for 30 seconds at the lamp before returning outside. This cycle repeated until the entire surface was cleared. The most terrifying moments were when everything went completely dark, a fault so severe that it couldn't be fixed quickly. If the lens cracked, or the kerosene tank tipped over, or lightning struck the lamp and burned out all the wiring, those moments could mean disaster. By the end of the 19th century, some lighthouses had already installed electric lighting.
But during such crises, the keeper was left alone with complete darkness, with the terrifying realization that he had failed his mission. The guilt was unbearable. It didn't matter whether he was truly at fault or not. What mattered was that the light was out. Somewhere out at sea, a ship might be navigating blindly. The captain relies on the lighthouse's beam to steer clear of rocks, but if he doesn't see it, he could run aground. Hundreds, maybe thousands of lives could be lost by your mistake, by your oversight, by your failure to check or prepare. That thought gnawed relentlessly at his mind, refusing to let him rest. The lighthouse worker dashed around the lantern room, trying to come up with solutions, fixing something, lighting torches or candles, any kind of light, to be carried out onto the gallery and waved in hope that someone might see it. But a torch, compared to the lighthouse lens, was like a match compared to a spotlight. Its visibility was only about 200 meters at most. Falling asleep on such a night was unthinkable. Even if the body was exhausted from fatigue, even if the eyes kept closing, even if he knew there was nothing more to do before dawn, sleep refused to come. Conscience kept him awake. He lay on the cot with his eyes wide open, listening to the sea and waiting for the sound of destruction. Metal grinding against rocks, shouts, explosions. Every splash of a wave seemed to signal the start of a catastrophe. His heart pounded, sweat trickled down his temples, and the room felt cold. And so he stayed like that until dawn. In the morning, as the first light appeared, the lighthouse keeper would rise to the highest point of the tower and gaze out at the sea. He searched for debris and signs of a wreckage. If he found nothing, he would breathe a sigh of relief. It was a moment of relief. Either there had been no ships, or they had passed by on a different route, or the captains were experienced enough to avoid the lighthouse altogether. A sunken vessel was discovered, and a sunken vessel was discovered, and investigations revealed that the lighthouse had not been lit that night. Then the end of service, the end of reputation, the end of everything. There had been cases where lighthouse workers had gone insane after such nights, unable to forgive themselves for the extinguished light. One keeper, whose windows had shattered during a storm and whose lamp had been blown out, could not endure what had happened. A week later, he was found dead in the same lantern room. He left a note. "I cannot live knowing someone might have died because of me." An investigation showed that on that night, no vessel had suffered damage, but that no longer mattered. Another keeper, after a similar incident, had stopped sleeping altogether. He kept watch around the clock, eyes never closing. 2 months later, he was removed from the lighthouse. He began to see hallucinations, talking to ghosts of drowned sailors who allegedly appeared to him and begged for help. The doctors said it was nervous exhaustion, but he insisted until the end of his life. They were real spirits, and they came because I failed to keep the light safe. The darkness in the lighthouse was special, not like in a normal house. In a house, darkness is just the absence of light. But in the lighthouse, darkness was alive, almost tangible. It pressed down, enveloped, seeped into the lungs. In it, he heard sounds that should not exist. Whispers, footsteps, door creaks. The sea roared outside, the wind howled. And amid that din, words could be discerned. Though, of course, they were illusions, products of imagination. Still, when you are alone in a stone tower surrounded by an abyss, and the only light is your extinguished lamp, the mind begins to weave miracles. Some keepers claimed, on nights like that, they felt the presence of someone, or something, like there was still someone watching in the darkness. You turn around, and there's nobody. You light a candle. Nothing. But that feeling never leaves.
One lighthouse worker recounted that when his lamp went out, he heard breathing. Not his own, but someone else's, heavy and slow. He froze, listened. It was breathing nearby, just a few steps away. He lit a match with trembling hands. Around him, it was silent. The breathing stopped. He thought he had imagined it, snuffed out the match, and then the breathing resumed. So he sat there until dawn, holding a candle, afraid to extinguish it. Sleep in total darkness was impossible for another reason: the fear of sleeping through it. If the light went out and he tried to relight it, he couldn't fall asleep for even a minute. Suddenly the mechanism might start working again, the wick might catch fire, or kerosene might somehow appear. He had to stay alert, check, test, never give up. That's why the keepers sat through the entire night, battling against breakdowns, darkness, and their own despair. But there were nights when it became clear. There was nothing to do until morning. A part was broken. There was no spare. The glass was shattered. There was nothing to replace it with. The kerosene had run out, and there was no reserve. All that remained was to wait for dawn and for help to arrive. And so, during those hours when the struggle had finally ended and the light of day was still far away, a strange state would set in. The lighthouse keeper would sit on the floor of the lantern room, leaning back against the cold wall, simply sitting in darkness, in complete silence within. Because outside, the sea was roaring fiercely. Thoughts would stop, fear dulled by exhaustion, leaving only emptiness behind. Some would fall asleep right there on the floor, without making it to the bed. The body would simply shut down.
Sleep was heavy and restless, filled with nightmares. Sometimes dreams involved sinking ships, screaming people, waves crashing overhead with destructive force. Other times it was an attempt to light the lamp, but the matches were wet, hands refused to obey, and time seemed to slip away. They would wake up in a cold sweat, jumping up, unsure of where they were. Then memory would return. The lighthouse, the darkness, the breakdown, and everything would start over again. The morning after such a night was either a relief or a verdict. A relief if help had arrived, bringing parts, kerosene, new glass panes. A verdict if no aid came, and the keeper had to survive another day, another night in the darkness, knowing each minute was a risk. After such nights, the keepers would sit, looking exhausted. Gray hairs would start to show in their hair, wrinkles deepened. Their gaze became heavy and burdened. Interestingly, many lighthouse workers, when recalling their service, stated that their most vivid memories were not of peaceful shifts or routine nights, but of those nights filled with catastrophe. Because during those moments, they truly felt alive, responsible for others' lives, fighting against the elements, conquering fear. And if they managed to endure, they felt they had proven their worth. But darkness left its mark not only on their memories. It seeped deeper into the subconscious, into that part of the mind that awakens when the eyes are shut. After nights spent in absolute darkness, after hours battling a dying light, after experiencing terror, the keepers would finally lie down to sleep. And there, in their dreams, the darkness would continue its work. It would transform into images, voices, visions. The sea would start to speak. The lighthouse would come alive. Ghost ships would appear on the horizon, and the line between reality and dreams would blur so much that sometimes it became impossible to tell if what they saw was real or just a dream. Dreams at the edge of the world were different from ordinary ones, just as seawater differs from river water. Both are water,
Yet try tasting them and you will feel the difference instantly. Dreams on the lighthouse were salty and thick. They did not dissolve at dawn, but stayed in memory for years, sometimes for a lifetime. Why was that? It's not hard to understand. The body, exhausted from lack of sleep, constant stress, and loneliness, began to function differently. The brain, deprived of its usual stimuli, conversations, faces, events, compensated during sleep by creating entire worlds, populating them with characters and staging dramas. The subconscious, which in everyday life slumbered in the back corners of the mind, would burst forth here and do as it pleased. And there was plenty of material for creativity. The sea, the light, darkness, fear, longing. Out of this, dreams emerged. Though calling them dreams is a stretch, they were more like visions. Most often, the sea was the central theme. It made perfect sense because it was constantly around. Its sound was embedded so deeply in the mind that it became part of the inner world. But in dreams, the sea did not behave as it did on the eve. It did not speak metaphorically, but literally, with a voice that resembled a human's, but was deeper and more resonant. The lighthouse keeper would stand on the shore or at the top of the lighthouse and hear the waves calling their name. "Ivan, come down! Peter, come here!" His voice was gentle, almost tender, yet beneath it lurked a strength that was impossible to resist. And in his dreams, the lighthouse keeper would descend, walk toward the water, enter it, and wake up with a pounding heart, drenched in sweat. One lighthouse worker recorded in the logbook, "The sea again." It beckoned him, whispering that beneath the waves, warmth and silence reigned, and there were no more watch shifts, no wind. For a moment, he almost agreed. He would wake up when the water was already up to his chest. He realized he was standing by the window, clutching the frame, and if he took one more step, he would fall. Sleepwalking at the lighthouse was a common phenomenon. Fatigue and lack of sleep played their part. In dreams, a person could stand, walk, even climb the stairs, only to wake up in the most unexpected place. That's why experienced keepers would tie themselves to their bunks with a rope at night, not out of fear of falling, but out of terror of going where the voice from their dreams called. Ghost ships haunted almost everyone's dreams. It was a classic lighthouse nightmare. You'd see the sea in your sleep, and a vessel, old-fashioned with slanted sails, or modern with smokestacks and masts. It moved slowly, silently. No one was on deck, or sometimes the ship was crowded, yet all the figures were motionless, like statues. The ship approached the lighthouse, and it became clear that it was heading toward the rocks, about to be shattered. The keeper would try to shout, wave his arms, turn on the brighter light, but nothing worked. His voice wouldn't obey, his hands wouldn't move. The light dimmed, and the ship rammed into the rocks, split in half, and sank. And he would stand there, helpless, watching, unable to change anything. He'd wake from such dreams with a sense of guilt, even though he knew it was just a nightmare. Yet the feeling would linger all day. It seemed as if, somewhere in reality, the ship had truly sunk, and it was his fault. After such dreams, some keepers would get up before their shift began, scan the horizon with binoculars for debris or floating bodies. Of course, they found nothing, but only after checking could they find peace. There were dreams of transformations. The lighthouse would come alive, turning into a living creature, vast, ancient, yet with a heart beating somewhere deep within the tower's core. In sleep, the keeper understood that he didn't just live inside a building, but within a living organism. The staircase was the spine, the lantern room was the head,
and he himself was like a parasite or a symbiont that maintained this stone giant. The lighthouse didn't speak with words, but with sensations. It conveyed exhaustion, pain from the pounding waves, longing for sunny days. The keeper felt this so vividly that it was as if he himself had become the lighthouse. Another possibility was that the lighthouse would lift off from the ground and drift across the sea like a ship, or soar through the sky like a dirigible. The keeper would look down and see waves or clouds passing beneath him. The feeling was doubled. On one side, freedom. On the other, terror. Because if the lighthouse was flying, it meant it was no longer fulfilling its duty. It was no longer anchored, no longer pointing the way. It was a traitor. And this thought gnawed at him from within, even in sleep. Repeating dreams were especially tormenting. One recurring scenario was night after night, like a scratched record that couldn't be turned off. Someone dreamed they were climbing the stairs, but the staircase was endless. The steps kept going up, and the lantern room never seemed to draw nearer. Exhausted, they would sit down to rest, only to realize that stopping meant they'd never reach the top. So they kept climbing, all the way until waking. Another dream was that they had forgotten to light the lamp. Night fell, darkness spread, and then the realization, the lamp isn't burning. They would run up the stairs, try to light it, but the matches were all damp, every single one. They would try to scratch the matches against each other like primitive humans, but it was no use. Time moves forward, and somewhere out at sea, ships are sailing through the darkness, yet no light guides their way. Panic begins to rise, hearts pounding in the chest, and suddenly you wake up.
You realize it was only a dream, and you breathe out in relief, only to fall asleep again and find yourself trapped in the same recurring vision. Sometimes these dreams could last for weeks. The lighthouse keepers tried various methods to fight against these repeating dreams. Some kept a journal immediately after waking, believing that if they recorded the dream on paper, it would stop recurring. Sometimes it worked. Others invented alternative endings, mentally replaying the dream, but with a different conclusion. For example, if they dreamed of an endless staircase, they imagined reaching the top. Sometimes the brain accepted this version, and the dream changed. There were lighthouse workers who believed in the messages dreams carried. They recorded everything they saw in sleep, and then compared it with reality. If the night before a storm they dreamed of a dark, raging sea, it was considered a warning. If they saw a ship with white sails, it meant good news from the shore. Of course, most of these coincidences were just chance, but living in complete isolation made every sign seem meaningful. It was a way to find purpose, to feel connected to something greater. One keeper claimed that he once saw in a dream the exact time of a ship's wreck. He woke in the middle of the night, looked at his watch. It was 2:30 in the morning. In his dream, he saw a vessel hitting the rocks. Precisely at that moment, he had risen to the lantern room and looked through the binoculars. Nothing was there, just calm sea. He dismissed it as a nightmare. But the next day, news arrived. That very night, at 2:30, a cargo ship had sunk 50 miles from the lighthouse. Coincidence? Possibly. But the keeper remained convinced for the rest of his life that it was a premonition. Dreams about home were the most desired, yet the most painful. They would dream of the familiar house, the warm stove, a wife exhausted after a long day, children playing on the floor. Everything felt so real. The scent of pies, the sound of laughter,
The warmth, sitting at the table, eating hot soup, feeling so peaceful and content. And then waking up and realizing where you really are. Cold stone walls, the howling wind, loneliness. The contrast was so stark that it made you want to close your eyes and slip back into sleep. But it was impossible. Dreams didn't come back on command. After such visions, the entire day felt like walking through fog, performing tasks mechanically while the mind remained in the house with family. It seemed that real life was there, in the dream, and what was happening now was only an illusion, an unreal existence. Some keepers admitted that they sometimes got confused. They believed the shift was over, that they would descend and be greeted by their wife, fed, put to bed properly. But instead they found themselves in an empty, cold room. Each time, it was a shock. Interestingly, dreams affected their reality almost physically. After a nightmare night, a keeper would wake up exhausted, as if he hadn't slept at all. Muscles ached, and his head felt like it was splitting open. Conversely, after good dreams, he would wake up invigorated, even if he had only slept for 3 hours. One lighthouse worker kept track of how many hours he slept and what kind of dreams he had. He discovered that 2 hours of restful sleep gave him more strength than 5 hours filled with nightmares. The body recovered not so much from the quantity of sleep, but from its quality. There were keepers who learned to influence their dreams, at least partially. Before falling asleep, they would tell themselves, "Tonight I will fly," or "Tonight I want to see the sea calm." Sometimes it worked. They would fall asleep and truly soar over the water like a seagull, or see the sea smooth as a mirror with the sun shining above. These dreams became a gift, a reward for enduring the hardships of duty. Waking up after such dreams, they would smile, feeling happy all day long. Some people dream of departed relatives who come silently and sit beside them on the bed, either watching in silence or whispering something important. Advice, warnings, comfort. The lighthouse keepers did not fear such dreams. On the contrary, they looked forward to them, because these visits connected them to the past, to those who had already gone. One lighthouse worker recounted that he regularly dreamed of his grandfather, a former sailor. The old man would come, sit at the edge of the bed, and tell stories about distant lands, storms, and fellow sailors. The keeper would wake up and remember these stories in vivid detail, recording them in a small notebook. Later, upon returning home, he showed his mother the entries. She burst into tears. These, she said, were his real stories. She had heard them directly from him during her childhood. But where did these stories come from in the dreams of a grandson who had never heard them before? An enigma. Whether it was true or simply a fabrication, only you can decide. Sometimes the dreams were absurd and almost humorous. Once he dreamed that instead of a lighthouse lantern, there was a giant candle, and the wind kept blowing it out. He had to run around with matches, lighting it again and again. Or that the lighthouse had turned into something edible, made of marzipan or chocolate, and seagulls were pecking at it in pieces. He would try to shoo them away, but they wouldn't listen. He'd wake up from such dreams with a sense of relief, and even find himself laughing. Then he'd say aloud to himself, "What foolishness I've dreamt." Still, these silly dreams at least softened the gloom of the other, darker visions. Dreams were part of the lighthouse life, just like watches, meals, or loneliness. They could not be avoided, nor could they be fully controlled. All that remained was to accept them. When you close your eyes at the edge of the world, you enter another realm, a world where the sea speaks, where lighthouses fly, where the boundary between life and death is as thin as morning fog. And each time you return from there, you are a little different, slightly changed from who you were yesterday. By the end of a long winter, the lighthouse worker began to understand that dreams were not merely reflections of fatigue or fears. They were a way for the soul to communicate when the wind and responsibilities during the day became overwhelming. Dreams served as a compass, showing what was happening inside, where you were headed, what you feared, what you longed for. And the paradox was that, right here, at the edge of the abyss, amidst solitude and cold, many keepers first truly heard themselves, not through words or thoughts, but through images that came at night and stayed forever. Then, spring arrived. The ice melted, a ship appeared bringing a relief crew, and the keeper, gathering his sparse belongings, looked at the lighthouse one last time. Everything here, the watches, the letters, the dreams, moved into the past, but they never vanished. They remained inside, like a warmth that never truly extinguishes. There are occupations everyone knows, yet few think about. Teachers, doctors, postal workers. They are visible, their work understandable. But there are professions like that of the ghost, those that linger somewhere on the edge of society's consciousness. They seem to exist, seem important, but as long as everything is fine, people forget about them. The lighthouse keeper belonged exactly to this kind. A ship safely sailed past the reefs. The captain saw the light, adjusted course, and reached the port. Then simply forgot. Forgot about the person who stayed awake all night so that this light would burn. Forgot about the cold stone tower, the howling wind, the loneliness.
Just made a note in the ship's log. Passed the lighthouse at 020, and that was all.
Yet the paradox was that the keepers did not seek gratitude. They did their work not for recognition, nor for awards or honors. They did it because someone had to do it. Someone had to stay alert while others slept. Someone had to keep the light shining while darkness surrounded them. It was a calling in the most ancient, almost religious sense of the word. You are responsible for the fire, for ensuring it never goes out. And it doesn't matter whether anyone sees your efforts or not. Only one thing matters. The fire must burn. If you gather everything we've talked about, the stone sleeping quarters with their rigid bunks, the erratic sleep schedule, strange food, letters that never arrived, the extinguished light, and dreams over the abyss, you wouldn't just have a description of a job. You'd have a portrait of a peculiar kind of person. A person who has learned to sleep standing up, to eat yesterday's porridge with gratitude, to converse with the sea, and not to go insane from loneliness. Someone who every night stood on the boundary between life and death, his own and someone else's, and every morning rose to repeat it all anew. It's interesting that many lighthouse keepers, after finishing their service and returning to normal life, couldn't quite adjust. It was too noisy, too crowded, too hectic. One former lighthouse keeper recounted that in the first week on shore, he slept in a shed because the house was unbearably stuffy and cramped. His wife was offended, the children bewildered, but he couldn't do otherwise. He needed silence, true silence, which exists only on a lighthouse, when there's nothing around but the sea and the wind. Another couldn't sleep on a bed with a soft mattress. He would sink into it like into a swamp and suffocate. Instead, he laid a thin mattress on the floor and slept there.
His wife laughed, saying he had become totally wild on his lighthouse. But he hadn't gone wild. He simply got used to a different kind of silence. Hard, simple, honest. A soft bed seemed like a deception. an attempt to hide from reality. But he was used to facing reality head-on. A third man returned to the lighthouse after 6 months, unable to cope with ordinary life. He said, "Nothing here is real. People pretend to care about trivial things. They quarrel over petty matters. I remember what it's like when lives depend on you." After that, everything else seemed like just a game. He went back to his lighthouse and served there until his death, ending his days in his cabin, amid the sound of the surf. Colleagues said, "You couldn't imagine a better way for a lighthouse keeper to finish his life." Sleeping on the lighthouse was not just a physiological need. It was an act of trust. Trust in the mechanism to keep working while you slept. Trust in the colleague who would take over the watch. And trust in yourself to wake up on time, to hear if something went wrong. That trust was cultivated over months and years, and once it was built, the keeper could finally rest easy. Not deeply. Deep sleep at a lighthouse was a luxury, but peacefully, knowing he had done everything he could, and everything else was out of his control. There were keepers who, after retirement, suffered from insomnia, unable to fall asleep without the sound of the sea. They would set a radio near their beds, tuned to static noise, which remotely resembled the surf, or record the sound of waves on a tape recorder and play it during the night. Modern people might find that strange. Why need noise to fall asleep? But for those who had spent years on a lighthouse, it was not noise. It was lullaby music, under which hundreds of nights fell asleep. Without it, sleep was restless and fraught with anxiety. Others, by contrast, reveled in the silence, sleeping in villages far from the sea, deep inland. They found enough in the sound of the wind, the crashing of waves, the squeak of metal structures. Now they wanted to hear birds singing, leaves rustling, cows mooing outside the window. They longed for ordinary earthly sounds that serve as a reminder. You are among people. You are not alone. You are home. If you ask former lighthouse keepers, what do you think about when you recall the lighthouse? Their answers would be as varied as they are many. Someone once recalled dawns when the sun rose from the sea, painting everything in gold. Others remembered storms, when the lighthouse trembled from the pounding waves, but held steady. Some spoke of letters from their wives, read so often they were worn thin, and others of sleep. That special, fragile, precious sleep, snatched in 20-minute intervals between shifts. Sleep filled with visions of home, family, warmth. Sleep from which they awoke to climb once more to tend their light. The lighthouse taught many lessons. Patience in waiting for a shift that might be delayed by a month. Humility in accepting what cannot be changed. Responsibility in knowing that a mistake could cost lives. But the greatest lesson of all the lighthouse imparted was to cherish the simple things. Warm food, dry clothing, 3 hours of uninterrupted sleep, a letter from home, a clear night without a storm. These simple treasures, often unnoticed in everyday life, became as valuable as diamonds on the lighthouse. And among these, sleep was one of the most precious. Because sleep is not merely rest, it is the chance to let go of control, to cease being a guardian, a keeper, an alert sentry, simply to be human, tired and eager to sleep. For a few hours, or even minutes, to set down the responsibility for the entire world, to allow oneself weakness, and to trust that the world will not collapse while you rest. Paradoxically, the lighthouse keepers, those who guarded the sleep of sailors, slept the least of all.
To ensure ships could sail peacefully, to let captains sleep soundly in their cabins, knowing the lighthouse would guide their way, the keepers sacrificed their own sleep. It was a silent pact. I do not sleep, so you can rest peacefully. You may not know about me, may never thank me, may never even think of me, but I am here. I am awake, my light shining. There was a profound beauty in this, the beauty of service that no one notices, the beauty of sacrifice that goes unrecognized, the beauty of labor visible only to those who have endured it themselves. The keepers formed an invisible brotherhood of people who understood the true value of light in darkness. When they met somewhere, by the shore, in a port, at a market, they recognized each other without words. By a glance, a gait, the particular fatigue in their eyes, and a nod. Nothing more needed to be said. Everything was understood. It's hard for modern minds to imagine such a life. Today, lighthouses are automated. Most operations run without human intervention. The light turns on by timer. Machinery is serviced once a month. The romance has faded. But so has the incredible tension, the responsibility that once weighed heavily on the shoulders of the keepers. Now, one can sleep peacefully, knowing the machine does not tire, does not fall asleep, does not make mistakes. That's progress. That's advancement. But in doing so, something has been lost. The connection between human and light has vanished. The understanding that the light is not just a bulb, but someone's sleepless night. When the last keepers left the automated beacons, many admitted feeling like traitors, abandoning their posts. It was as if they were betraying some ancient tradition, the legacy of their ancestors. They knew the machine could handle it better, more reliably, more precisely, without emotion. But it still hurt. One elderly lighthouse worker, on his final departure, stroked the tower wall as one might caress an old horse, whispering, "Sorry, I'd stay if I could, but the times are different now." And he walked away without looking back. Thus ended an era, the era of people who slept on the edge of the world, between sky and water, between sleep and wakefulness. An age when the lighthouse's glow was warmth, human presence, not cold electric illumination. This era remains etched in memory, captured in the logs of lighthouse keepers, preserved in letters stored in archives, and alive in the dreams of the few who still remember what it was like to fall asleep to the roar of the sea, knowing that in 2 hours they would have to rise again. Somewhere far away, on the edge of the world, the old lighthouses still stand. Some operate automatically, others are abandoned, their glass shattered, mechanisms rusted. Yet their towers remain, as monuments to those who once lived here, stayed awake, slept in snatches, and kept the flame alive. These are not monuments of marble, but of stone and iron. They bear no inscriptions, only silence. Yet if you listen closely, if you arrive there quiet on a winter evening and stand still at the base of a tower, you can hear. You can hear echoes of footsteps on the spiral staircase, the creak of an old cot, the rustle of a letter being read for the 100th time, a human sigh from someone who has just lain down, knowing that in 20 minutes they must rise again. There is warmth there, human, almost forgotten, still alive within these towers. It has seeped into the stones like the smell of kerosene that clings to clothing. It has not vanished. It has simply receded into the depths, hidden from the modern world. Yet it remains. As long as the lighthouses stand and someone remembers their story, this warmth will not fade.
It will continue to warm those who know how to feel it, those who understand the price of sleepless nights spent for the peace of others. So next time you lie in a warm bed under a soft blanket, in silence and safety, remember. Remember those who once slept on hard cots in cold storerooms, in double bunks. Those who did not sleep so others could rest peacefully. Those who kept the light burning in the darkness. Perhaps your sleep will become a little more peaceful because of it. And somewhere over the sea, far away, a tiny flame will continue to flicker in the night. It does not matter whether it burns because of a person or a machine. What matters is that it burns. What matters is that someone once decided, there will be light here. And that is warmth. The warmth of a human decision to keep the fire alive. A flame that never goes out. Good night. Sleep well. Somewhere on the edge of the world, a lighthouse keeps watch for you. Thank you for watching Lectures Under the Moon. I'm Daniel Hayes. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories.